What Mr. Davis didn't know was how many times she'd repeated those words to herself, through failed auditions, through the painful early days in Los Angeles when she'd barely had enough money to eat, through the crushing disappointments when roles she desperately wanted went to others. Rejection isn't a stop sign. It's just a detour. Those hadn't been the only moments Mr. Davis had made a difference. There was the time during her junior year when a group of popular girls had mocked her ambitions. Hollywood? Bethany Williams had sneered by the lockers. You'll be waiting tables in a month and back home in 3. Julia had maintained her composure until she reached the second-floor bathroom, the one fewer students used. There, leaning against the wall, she'd fought back tears of doubt and humiliation. Coming out, she'd nearly collided with Mr. Davis, who was placing a wet floor sign in the hallway. "Everything all right, Miss Julia?" he'd asked, concern evident. In his voice, "Just some girls being girls," she'd muttered. Mr. Davis had nodded thoughtfully. "You know what I've noticed about folks who mock other people's dreams?" Julia had shaken her head. "They're usually the ones most afraid to chase their own." He'd adjusted his sign deliberately. "I've cleaned a lot of classrooms over the years. Read the essays students leave behind, seen the artwork they create. There's a lot of talent in these halls, but talent without courage doesn't get very far." He'd looked directly at her then. "You've got both. Don't let anyone tell you different." "You really believed in me," Julia said softly in the diner, coming back to the present, when it wasn't exactly fashionable to do so. Mr. Davis shrugged as if it had been the most natural thing in the world. "You had a light about you. Some folks have it, this determination that shines through. Besides," he added with a wink, "I've always had good taste in future celebrities." They laughed together, and Julia marveled at how comfortable she felt with this man who'd known her before fame, before Oscar speeches and magazine covers, before the world knew her name. There had been other moments too, Mr. Davis quietly allowing her to use the empty chemistry lab to practice monologues after school, him accidentally leaving the auditorium unlocked on weekends so she could rehearse, the books on acting he'd sometimes leave near her locker with a simple note. Found. This might be useful. Small acts of kindness that had formed a safety net during those fragile years when dreams feel both impossibly distant and achingly vital. "I never properly thanked you," Julia said, covering his weathered hand with her own. "For seeing something in me worth believing in." Mr. Davis looked embarrassed. "Was nothing special, just did what any decent person would do." But they both knew that wasn't true. In the battlefield of adolescence, a single ally could make all the difference, especially one who asked for nothing in return. As the afternoon light slanted through the diner windows, Julia studied the man across from her, his stooped shoulders, the work clothes worn smooth from years of labor, the gentle dignity in his gaze. A man who had spent his life in the background, quietly shaping generations of students through small acts of kindness. And yet here he was at 80, still mopping floors instead of enjoying the retirement he deserved. In that moment, Julia Roberts, who had traveled from small-town Georgia to become one of the most beloved actresses in the world, made a decision. It was time to rewrite the ending to Mr. Davis's story. As their dinner at Nell's diner stretched into the evening, Julia found herself leaning forward, elbows on the worn table, absorbing every detail of Mr. Davis's life story, a story he told without embellishment or self-pity, as matter of fact as the weather. "Eleanor and I married in '68, he said, a gentle smile transforming his weathered face as he spoke of his late wife. 53 years together before cancer took her 3 years back. Julia noticed how his fingers absently twisted the simple gold band he still wore. "That's beautiful, Mr. Davis. 53 years. "Frank," he corrected her with a chuckle. "Reckon you're old enough now to call me by my first name." "Frank," Julia repeated, smiling. "Tell me about Eleanor." His eyes lit up. She was a kindergarten teacher. Had a way with children like nobody I ever knew. Patient, kind, but didn't take any nonsense either. He pulled out his wallet, carefully extracting a faded photograph of a woman with bright eyes and a warm smile, standing beside a younger version of himself. "Our 50th anniversary, last big celebration we had." Julia studied the photo, noting the love evident in their expressions. "She was beautiful." Inside and out, Frank agreed, gently returning the photo to his wallet. We had plans, you know, for retirement. Little cabin up in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Eleanor always wanted to wake up to those misty mountain views. Something in his tone made Julia pause. What happened to those plans? Frank's shoulders slumped slightly. Life happened. Eleanor's treatments weren't all covered by insurance. 8 rounds of chemo, experimental treatments in Atlanta. Wiped out our savings, then our retirement fund. Had to sell the land we'd bought for that cabin too. He straightened up, as if shaking off the weight of those memories. But she got 3 more years than doctors predicted. Worth every penny. Julia felt a tightness in her chest. And after she passed, found myself in an empty house with bills still coming in. Mortgage wasn't paid off like we'd planned. Figured I'd work a few more years until I got things sorted out. He shrugged. Then a few years turned into a few more. Don't. You have children who could help? Julia asked gently. 2 wonderful kids. Sarah's in Oregon, teaching like her mother. Michael's in the army, stationed in Germany. Pride colored his voice. Both doing well, both with families of their own to support. They offered to help, of course, but... He shook his head firmly. Never wanted to be a burden. They send plane tickets twice a year so I can visit the grandkids. That's plenty. Julia listened, increasingly troubled by the picture emerging. A man who had given decades of service, who had shaped countless young lives, including her own, now trapped in a cycle of endless work, not by choice but by necessity. And the school? No pension plan? Frank snorted softly. Started too early. For the good benefits. What I get barely covers prescriptions and property tax. School administrators let me stay on. Reduced hours officially, but I still do the full work. They're doing me a favor, way they see it. A favor. Julia suppressed a flare of indignation. An 80-year-old man mopping floors wasn't being done a favor. He was being exploited by a system that had failed him. Do you enjoy the work still? She asked carefully. Frank considered this. Some days. I like being around the students, seeing their faces. Different kids now, always on those phones, but underneath they're the same as your generation. Same hopes, same fears. He smiled wistfully. But the work itself? Knees aren't what they used to be. Back gives me trouble. Take more aspirin than my doctor likes. The waitress approached with coffee refills, her eyes widening as she finally recognized Julia. To her credit, she simply smiled, filled their cups, and retreated without making a fuss. How much longer do you plan to work, Frank? Julia asked. Once they were alone again. He looked down at his coffee. Haven't really thought about it, can't afford not to, so no point in planning otherwise. Something in Julia's expression must have betrayed her distress, because Frank quickly added, Now don't you worry about me, I've had a good life, still having one. Not everyone gets to say they made a difference, but I like to think I have. In my small way. Julia reached across the table, taking his weathered hand in hers. There was nothing small about the difference you made to me, Frank. Those words of encouragement, those small kindnesses, they stayed with me through some very dark times in Hollywood. Frank looked embarrassed by her earnestness. You would have made it regardless. Had that spark from the beginning. Maybe, Julia conceded. But knowing someone believed in me made the journey less lonely. She squeezed his hand gently before letting go. I've never forgotten that. As the evening deepened, their conversation drifted to happier topics. Frank asked about her children, her favorite roles, her life in California. Julia found herself sharing stories she rarely told in interviews, the real challenges of balancing motherhood and career, the projects that had moved her most deeply, the moments of doubt that still occasionally crept in despite her success. There was something freeing about talking to someone who had known her before, someone whose eyes held no agenda, no calculation, just genuine interest and that same kindness she remembered from decades ago. When the check came, Frank reached for his wallet, but Julia waved him off with a smile. Please, this one's on me. A gentleman pays for dinner, he protested mildly. Even when his dinner companion can buy the restaurant? Julia teased. Frank conceded with a chuckle. Never thought I'd be having dinner with a movie star. The boys, here at the school, won't believe it. As they stepped outside into the warm Georgia evening, Julia impulsively asked, Could I see where you live? I'd love to continue our conversation. If Frank was surprised by the request, he didn't show it. It's nothing fancy, but you're welcome anytime. They drove in comfortable silence, Julia following Frank's directions as he navigated them through familiar streets to a small, well-worn bungalow on the outskirts of town. The paint was peeling, the roof clearly in need of repair, but the small garden out front was meticulously maintained, bright marigolds and zinnias adding splashes of color in the growing darkness. Eleanor's flowers, Frank explained as he noticed Julia looking. Try to keep them going for her. As he unlocked the front door and led her inside, Julia Roberts, who had walked red carpets and dined in palaces, felt something resolve within. Her heart. Frank Davis would never have to worry about medical bills or mortgage payments again. And those Blue Ridge Mountains his Eleanor had dreamed of. They were about to get a new cabin with the best view money could buy. Back in her hotel suite, Julia paced the plush carpeting, phone pressed to her ear. The opulence of the room, with its king-sized bed, marble bathroom and panoramic city views, stood in stark contrast to the modest bungalow she'd just left. Frank's home had been clean and tidy, but signs of struggle were evident everywhere. The leaking faucet he'd been meaning to fix, the taped-up window in the kitchen, the ancient heating system he admitted only worked most days. "I need you to clear my schedule for the next 3 days," Julia told her assistant, determination hardening her voice. "Everything except the final documentary shoot can wait." "But Julia, you have that meeting with reschedule it. This is important." She ended the call and immediately dialed another number. Julia had spent her career making decisive choices, which roles to take, which projects to champion, which causes to support. But this decision felt different, more personal, more urgent. The image of Frank Davis shuffling through his small home, pointing out Eleanor's needlepoint pillows and the graduation photos of grandchildren he rarely saw, had stirred something deep within her. This wasn't about charity or a celebrity's random act of kindness. This was about justice, about ensuring that a man who had spent his life helping others could finally stop struggling. "Martin," she said when her financial advisor answered, "I need to set up a trust fund immediately." She outlined what she wanted, a comprehensive package that would provide Frank with complete financial security, mortgage paid, medical expenses, covered monthly income sufficient for comfort without extravagance, and travel funds to visit his children and grandchildren regularly. "We're talking about a significant amount, Julia," Martin cautioned. "At least, I don't care about the amount," Julia interrupted. "I care about doing this right." After ending the call, Julia stood at the window gazing out at the twinkling lights of Smyrna. The town had grown since her youth, but beneath the new shopping centers and housing developments, it remained the place where she'd first dared to dream. The place where Frank Davis had first told her those dreams were valid. Her phone buzzed with a text from the documentary director. "Incredible footage today. Your reunion with the janitor is emotional gold. Planning to make it a central thread." Julia frowned, typing back immediately. "His name is Frank Davis, and I need to speak with you about how we handle his story." She wouldn't allow Frank to become a mere footnote in her narrative, the kindly janitor who'd encouraged a future star. If his story was going to be told, it would be told with dignity, with purpose. It would highlight the systemic failures that forced an elderly man to continue working well beyond retirement age, not just serve as a heartwarming celebrity anecdote. Julia sat at the desk and opened her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard as she researched retirement statistics for school support staff, medical bankruptcy rates, and the cost of living increases that had outpaced pension plans. The more she read, the more her resolve strengthened. This wasn't just about Frank Davis. It was about the thousands of Franks across the country, people who worked their entire lives only to find themselves unable to retire with dignity. A new idea began to take shape in her mind, something bigger than a single trust fund. What if Frank's story could become a catalyst for broader change? Julia called her publicist next. "Rebecca, I need your help with something, but it needs to stay completely confidential for now." She outlined her plan to help Frank, adding, "And I want to explore creating a foundation for school support staff nationwide. Janitors, cafeteria workers, bus drivers, the people who keep schools running but often fall through the cracks of Retirement systems. That's ambitious, Rebecca replied cautiously, but potentially powerful. The press would love it, especially with the personal connection to your own past. I don't care what the press thinks, Julia said firmly. I care about making actual change happen, starting with Frank Davis. After hanging up, Julia opened her laptop again and began researching contractors in the area. The Blue Ridge Mountains weren't far from Smyrna, perhaps 2 hours north. Eleanor's dream of a mountain cabin could still come true, even if she wasn't here to see it. As midnight approached, Julia's suite had transformed into a command center. Notes covered the desk. Her phone battery had died twice from constant calls, and she'd compiled a comprehensive list of everything needed to transform Frank's life. Full retirement package, home repairs, or new housing medical coverage travel fund. For family visits, mountain cabin in Eleanor's memory, but one question remained: how to present this to a proud man who had refused his own children's offers of help. Frank Davis wasn't looking for handouts. He valued his independence, his dignity. Julia walked to the window again, remembering something Frank had said earlier that evening as he showed her a faded yearbook from her graduating class. Sometimes I wonder what became of all of them, he had mused, flipping through pages of young faces frozen in time. So many kids over the years, most move on, forget this place, forget the people who were part of their journey. But she hadn't forgotten, and therein lay the answer. This wouldn't be charity. It would be recognition, acknowledgement of the profound impact one seemingly ordinary man had made through countless small acts of kindness. It would be about honoring the ripple effects of a life dedicated to service, about making visible what had too long remained invisible. Julia checked her watch, nearly 1 a.m. Too late to call anyone else tonight, but her mind was made up. Tomorrow, she would set everything in motion. She climbed into bed, exhausted but certain. In Hollywood, Julia Roberts had become known for her radiant smile, for romantic comedies and dramatic roles that touched millions. But this quiet decision made in a hotel room in Smyrna, Georgia, might prove to be one of the most significant acts of her life. Sleep came slowly, as her mind continued to race with plans and possibilities. Frank Davis had once unlocked doors for a teenage girl with big dreams. Now it was her turn to unlock doors for him. Her last thought before drifting off was of Frank's weathered hands, still strong despite his age, still cleaning the same hallways where she had once walked. Hands that had offered quiet support when she needed it most. Tomorrow those hands would mop floors for the last time. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Julia's rental car pulled into the nearly empty Campbell High School parking lot. She'd chosen to arrive early before Frank's shift began at 7 to meet with Principal Harriet Jenkins. The documentary crew had been instructed to film elsewhere today. Julia needed privacy for what she was about to do. Principal Jenkins was waiting at the main entrance, her expression a mixture of excitement and curiosity. Few people received personal calls from Julia Roberts at 6 a.m. requesting urgent meetings. "Ms. Roberts, this is quite unexpected," the principal said, ushering Julia into her office. "How can I help you?" Julia sat down, declining the offered coffee. "I need to know everything about Frank Davis's employment situation. His benefits, his pension plan, his working conditions, everything." Principal Jenkins blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Mr. Davis, I'm not sure I can discuss personnel matters." "I understand confidentiality concerns," Julia said, her voice gentle but firm. "But I'm trying to help him, and to do that properly I need facts, not assumptions." For a moment, Principal Jenkins seemed to weigh her options. Then, with a small sigh, she opened a drawer and pulled out a personnel file. "Frank Davis is complicated," she began. "Technically, he should have retired years ago, but his financial situation after his wife's illness," she trailed off, flipping through the file. "The school board created a special position for him. Reduced hours on paper, lower pay than standard. It was the best we could do within the system's constraints." Julia leaned forward. "And his benefits?" "Minimal. Health coverage, no dental. His pension would be approximately $980 per month if he fully retired today." Julia did the quick math. Less than $12,000 a year. In today's economy, it was barely survival money. Has anyone ever looked into whether he qualifies for additional assistance programs? Julia asked. The principal's uncomfortable expression told her everything. In the bureaucracy of a public school system, individual needs often fell through the cracks, not from malice, but from overwork and limited resources. I'd like copies of his employment records, Julia said, and a breakdown of what full benefits would look like if the system weren't constrained. As Principal Jenkins gathered the requested documents, Julia's phone buzzed. Her real estate agent had found several properties in the Blue Ridge Mountains that might be suitable for Frank's cabin. She quickly scanned the listings, flagging 2 for immediate viewing. Next, she met with the school's maintenance supervisor, a gruff man named Mike who had worked alongside Frank for 15 years. "Best damn worker I've ever had," Mike declared, leaning against his cluttered desk. "Never calls in sick, never complains. Does the job of people half his age." "How is his health, really?" Julia pressed. "The physical demands of the job." Mike's expression softened. "It's taking a toll. Found him sitting on the floor last month, said he was just catching his breath. But I know his knees are shot. Back, too. He just won't admit it." Julia nodded, making mental notes. "And his home situation? Have you been to his house?" "Helped him fix his water heater last winter," Mike confirmed. "Place needs work. Roof's got maybe a year left. Heating systems from the Stone Age." He gave her a curious look. "Why all the questions?" "I'm trying to help an old friend," Julia said simply. After leaving the maintenance office, Julia walked the halls of Campbell High, retracing Frank's daily routine. She visited each bathroom he cleaned, each classroom he mopped, noting the stairs. He climbed multiple times daily, the heavy trash bags he hauled. The physical labor would be challenging for someone half his age. For an 80-year-old man with arthritis and knee problems, it was brutal. Back in her car, Julia made a series of calls to her financial team, to contractors, to medical specialists in the area. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle of what Frank Davis truly needed. Around noon, she drove to Nell's Diner, the same place where she and Frank had dined the previous evening. The lunch crowd was sparse, and the waitress, whose name tag read Doreen, recognized Julia immediately. "Well, look who's back," Doreen said warmly, sliding into the booth across from Julia after taking her order. "Frank Davis hasn't stopped talking about having dinner with you. You made that old man's decade." Julia smiled. "How long have you known Frank?" "Lord, forever," Doreen chuckled. "He and Eleanor used to come in every Friday night for 40-some years. After she passed, he still comes, sits at the same booth, orders the same meal." Her expression grew somber. "Broke all our hearts, seeing him alone." "Tell me about Eleanor," Julia prompted. Doreen's face softened with fond remembrance. "Sweetest woman you'd ever meet. Kindergarten teacher with the patience of a saint. Those two were like teenagers in love, even after 50 years. She lowered her voice. "The cancer was rough. Cleaned them out financially. Frank sold their car, his fishing boat, even Eleanor's mother's jewelry to pay for treatments not covered by insurance." Each new detail Julia uncovered strengthened her resolve. Frank Davis hadn't just fallen through society's cracks by accident. He'd sacrificed everything for love. After lunch, Julia visited 3 more places. Frank's church, where the pastor spoke of his faithful attendance and quiet generosity despite his limited means. The local pharmacy, where she learned which medications he regularly purchased. And finally, at the county records office, where she reviewed his property tax history and mortgage details. The picture that emerged was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Frank Davis had lived a life of quiet integrity, never seeking recognition, never complaining about his circumstances. When hardship struck, he had shouldered it alone rather than burden others. He had given his all to his wife's care, and when that battle was lost, he had simply continued working, one foot in front of the other, day after day. By late afternoon, Julia sat in her hotel room, surrounded by notes, documents, and recordings. Her team had compiled a comprehensive assessment of what Frank needed, financially, medically, and practically, to live his remaining years with dignity and comfort. Chakisi, Numbers were substantial but not astronomical, at least not for someone of Julia's wealth. What would be a life-changing sum for Frank was, for her, the equivalent of a minor production expense on one of her films. As she organized her findings, Julia's phone rang. It was her agent from Los Angeles. "Julia, what's going on? I'm hearing. You've cancelled meetings, pushed back readings." "Something came up," Julia replied. "Something important." "More important than the Spielberg project? Because he's not going to wait." "Then he won't wait," Julia said with unexpected calm. "Some things matter more than my next role." After ending the call, Julia stood by the window, watching the sun begin its descent over the town where she'd grown up. Tomorrow she would begin implementing her plan for Frank Davis. She had the facts, she had the resources, and she had the determination. What she didn't have, at least not yet, was his acceptance, and that, she suspected, might prove the greatest challenge of all. Julia chose the school library for their meeting, neutral ground that offered privacy while still being familiar, territory for Frank. She arrived early, arranging a small table in the corner away from windows that might attract curious onlookers. The documentary crew had been given strict instructions to stay away. This moment wasn't for cameras. She'd agonized over how to present her plan. A formal proposal felt too businesslike, a surprise announcement too theatrical. In the end, she'd decided on simplicity, honest conversation between two people who shared a history. At exactly 4 o'clock, Frank appeared in the doorway, still in his work uniform but freshly changed, his wispy white hair combed neatly to the side. He looked tired. Julia had watched him from a distance throughout the day, noting how he paused frequently to rest, how his movements grew stiffer as hours passed. "Miss Julia." He greeted her with a warm smile that momentarily erased the fatigue from his face. "Hope I didn't keep you waiting." "Not at all," she assured him, standing to pull out a chair. "Thank you for meeting me." Frank settled into the seat with a barely suppressed wince. "Principal Jenkins said it was important. Everything all right?" Julia took a deep breath. "Frank, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, about Eleanor, about your situation here at the school." "Now don't you worry about me," he began, but Julia gently raised a hand to stop him. "Please, just hear me out." She placed a slim folder on the table between them, but didn't open it yet. "You know, when I left Smyrna for Hollywood, I was terrified. Everybody told me I was chasing an impossible dream. Everybody except you." Frank looked down modestly. "Just told you what I saw." "What you saw meant everything to me," Julia said softly. "Your belief in me was this quiet force that I carried, with me through every rejection, every setback." She leaned forward. "Do you remember what you told me my senior year when I was panicking about my future?" Frank's brow furrowed in concentration. "Can't say I recall the exact words. You said, 'The truest measure of success isn't fame or fortune. It's what you do for others when you have the chance.'" Julia smiled at his surprised expression. "I've never forgotten that." "Sounds wiser than I had any right to be," Frank chuckled. "Maybe so, but it shaped me. Through all the Hollywood craziness, through the successes and failures, I've tried to hold on to that." Julia opened the folder, now turning it so he could see the contents. "And right now I have a chance to do something that matters." Frank stared at the documents before him, confusion evident in his expression. "I don't understand." "I've established a trust fund in your name," Julia explained gently. "It will provide you with a comfortable monthly income for the rest of your life, more than enough to retire immediately." Frank's hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the papers. "Miss Julia, I can't possibly—" "There's more," she continued. "Full medical coverage, everything Eleanor would have had if circumstances had been different. Your mortgage has been paid in full, and I've arranged for comprehensive renovations to your home to address the roof, the heating system, everything." Frank's eyes had grown wide, his breathing shallow. "This is too much. I never asked for—" "You never had to ask," Julia said firmly. "That's the point. You've spent your entire life giving to others, to students like me, to Eleanor during her illness. You've sacrificed your own comfort, your own dreams." She reached across the table, covering his weathered hand with hers. "It's time someone," Did the same for you. Frank sat in stunned silence, eyes moving between the documents and Julia's face, as if searching for the punchline to an elaborate joke. But why? He finally managed. Why would you do all this? Because you mattered, Julia said simply. Because you still matter. Because in a world that moves too fast and forgets too easily, some debts of gratitude should be paid. She smiled, softly, and because Eleanor's dream of that cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains deserves to come true. At the mention of Eleanor's dream, Frank's composure finally broke. Tears welled in his eyes, spilling silently down his weathered cheeks. I have one more thing to show you, Julia said, pulling out her phone and opening a series of photographs. I found the perfect spot, 10 acres overlooking the valley. The cabin needs work, but the view— She handed him the phone. Eleanor would have loved it. Frank stared at the images, his hand shaking so badly that Julia steadied it with her own. The photographs showed a rustic cabin surrounded by towering pines, with a sweeping view of misty blue mountains stretching to the horizon. It's exactly how she described it, he whispered. Every detail. It's yours, Julia said. Whether you want to live there full-time or just visit on weekends, whatever feels right. The property is already in your name. Frank carefully set the phone down, overwhelmed. I don't know what to say. You don't. I need to say anything, Julia assured him. But Frank straightened in his chair, summoning his dignity. I need to say this. I can't accept charity, Miss Julia. I've worked my whole life, paid my own way. This isn't charity, Julia interrupted, gently. This is recognition. This is acknowledgement of the difference you've made, not just to me, but to generations of students who walk these halls. She leaned forward, her expression earnest. If I'd never become an actress, if I'd never made a single film, your kindness would still have shaped who I am. That's a gift beyond measure, Frank. Let me give something back. Frank was silent for a long moment, his internal struggle evident in his expression. Finally, he looked up at her with tears still glistening in his eyes. Eleanor always said everything happens for a reason, he said quietly. When you walked back into that hallway yesterday, maybe she had a hand in that somehow. Julia smiled, blinking back her own tears. I think she might have. Frank took a deep, shuddering breath. I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to. Just promise me you'll actually retire. No more mopping these floors. No more pushing that cart up and down stairs. Your working days are done. Frank nodded slowly, the reality of his new circumstances beginning to sink in. It's hard to imagine. Been working since I was 14 years old. Well, now you get to rest, Julia said firmly. Doctor's orders. You're not a doctor, Frank pointed out with a small smile. No, but I play one in movies sometimes, and that's close enough. They both laughed, the tension of the moment broken. As they continued talking, reviewing the details of the trust fund and the renovations scheduled for his home, Julia watched the weight of decades of worry gradually lift from Frank's shoulders. His posture seemed straighter, his eyes brighter. By the time they finished, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the library windows. Frank Davis stood up, not as the tired school janitor who had entered an hour earlier, but as a man with a future stretching before him, filled with possibilities instead of hardship. Miss Julia, he said as they walked toward the exit, I believe I'll sleep well tonight. Julia smiled. That makes two of us, Frank. That makes two of us. Word traveled fast in small towns. By the following morning, whispers of Julia Roberts' extraordinary gesture had begun spreading through Smyrna like wildfire. Though Julia had requested discretion from those directly involved, the sight of contractors arriving at Frank's modest bungalow raised inevitable questions. Frank himself seemed dazed by the rapid changes unfolding around him. When Julia arrived, at his home early that morning, she found him sitting on his front porch, watching with bewilderment as a team of workers measured his roof and assessed the property's condition. Morning, Frank, Julia called, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the local cafe. Thought you might need this. He accepted the coffee with a grateful smile. They've been here since 7, he said, gesturing to the contractors. Fellow in the blue shirt says they're replacing the entire roof. Whole thing, not just the leaky spots. That's right, Julia confirmed, settling beside him on the porch steps. No more pots catching rainwater in your bedroom. Frank shook his head in wonder. Still feels like I might wake up and find this was all a dream. Not a dream, Julia assured him. Though I do have a question for you. Where would you like to stay while the renovations are happening? I've reserved a suite at the Marriott, but if you'd prefer somewhere else, a hotel? Frank looked alarmed. That's not necessary. I can make do with the construction. Been living with the leaks for years now. Julia gave him a gentle but firm look. Frank, this isn't a minor repair job. They're replacing the roof, updating the electrical system, installing new heating and cooling, renovating the bathroom to make it more accessible as you get older. She touched his arm lightly. The work will take at least 3 weeks, and your home won't be livable during that time. Frank's resistance gradually softened as the reality of the situation became clear. By noon, Julia had helped him pack essential belongings, and they were on their way to the hotel. The simple act of carrying his weathered suitcase to her car felt symbolic somehow, the physical beginning of his journey from one life to another. At the school, Principal Jenkins had arranged a small gathering in the teacher's lounge. When Frank arrived to formally submit his retirement notice, he was met with handmade cards from students, tearful hugs from longtime colleagues, and a cake decorated with the words, "Happy Retirement, Mr. Davis. We'll miss you terribly," confessed Mrs. Abernathy, the English teacher who had been at Campbell High for nearly 20 years. "Who'll let me in when I forget my keys now?" "Who'll fix the temperamental radiator in room 112, added Mr. Peterson. The physics teacher, Frank, overwhelmed by the outpouring of affection, struggled to find words. "I'm just a janitor," he said softly. "You were never just a janitor," Principal Jenkins corrected, handing him a framed photograph of the school. "You were the heart of this place." As Frank cleared out his small locker in the maintenance room, handing over his keys to Mike, his supervisor, the magnitude of the moment struck him. For 50 years these halls had been his second home. Now he was leaving them for good. "What will I do with myself?" he whispered to Julia as they left the building. "All those empty hours." "We'll figure that out together," she promised. Back at the hotel, Frank marveled at the suite Julia had arranged. The plush king-sized bed, the spacious bathroom with its deep soaking tub, the sweeping views of the town from the 10th floor window. "This is bigger than my whole house," he observed with a nervous laugh. While Frank rested, Julia met with the interior designer she'd hired to refresh his home. They pored over samples of flooring, paint colors, and furniture options. "Nothing too modern," Julia instructed. "He appreciates craftsmanship and durability, and keep Eleanor's touches intact, the garden, her needlepoint pillows, the family photos." "What about the kitchen?" the designer asked. "The current layout isn't ideal for someone his age. Update it, but keep it familiar, and make sure everything is accessible as he gets older. Wider doorways, grab bars in the bathroom, a walk-in shower instead of that old tub." That evening, Julia arranged for Frank's children to call him, Sarah from Oregon and Michael from Germany. She'd reached out to them the day before, explaining her plan and ensuring they were comfortable with her involvement in their father's life. "Dad, is it true?" Sarah asked when Frank answered the video call on the tablet Julia had given him. "You're actually retiring?" Frank nodded, still seeming slightly bewildered by it all. "Seems so. Miss Julia has—" He trailed off, emotion catching in his throat. "We've heard what she's doing, Dad," Michael said, his military posture visible even through the screen. "It's incredible." "I didn't want you kids worrying about me," Frank explained. "That's why I never said how tight things were." Sarah wiped away tears. "We always worried anyway, Dad, knowing you were still working at your age, living alone in that house with all its problems." "Well, that's changing now," Frank said with growing confidence. "And Miss Julia says there's money set aside for me to visit you all, see those grandkids and great-grandkids in person." As the conversation continued, Julia slipped quietly from the room, giving Frank privacy with his family. In the hotel corridor, she leaned against the wall, a profound sense of rightness settling over her. This was already working beyond her expectations. The next morning brought another surprise for Frank. When he and Julia arrived at his house to check on the renovation progress, they found not just the contracted workers, but a dozen community Volunteers as well. What's all this? Frank asked, stunned. Ben Mitchell, who owned the local hardware store, stepped forward. When we heard what was happening, we wanted to help. You fixed my son's bicycle when he crashed it before the big race. Remember that? 15 years ago? A middle-aged woman approached next. You found my daughter crying in the hallway when she didn't get into her first-choice college. Told her it wasn't the end, just a detour. She's a doctor now. One by one, community members shared their stories, small moments when Frank had made a difference in their lives, or their children's lives. Moments he had forgotten, but they had cherished. We're here to help with the garden, explained Eleanor's best friend, Patricia, gesturing to several elderly women with gardening gloves. We'll make sure Eleanor's flowers keep blooming. Frank stood frozen in place, overwhelmed by the outpouring of community support. Julia watched as the realization dawned on him. He had never been as invisible as he'd thought. All those years of quiet service had been seen and remembered. I don't know what to say, Frank managed finally, his voice thick with emotion. You don't need to say anything, Julia told him, gently guiding him to a chair set up in the shade of his front yard oak tree. Just watch. And so he did. For the rest of the day, Frank Davis, who had spent 50 years working in the background of other people's lives, witnessed firsthand the impact he had made on his community. As volunteers cleared brush, planted new flowers, and assisted the professional contractors, the transformation of his home became a metaphor for the transformation of his life. That night, back at the hotel, Frank stood at the window gazing out at the twinkling lights of Smyrna. You know what Eleanor would say about all this, he said without turning around. What's that? Julia asked. She'd say, see, Frank, I told you all along, kindness always comes back to you. Julia smiled. Smart woman, your Eleanor. The smartest, Frank agreed, finally turning from the window, with a peace in his eyes that hadn't been there before. And I think maybe she's been orchestrating this whole thing from somewhere beyond those stars. It began with a single tweet from a Campbell High student who had spotted Julia Roberts at the school. OMG, Julia Roberts is at our school helping our elderly janitor retire. Julia Roberts, kindness matters. The student had attached a blurry photo taken through a classroom window, showing Julia and Frank walking across the parking lot. Within hours, the post had been shared thousands of times, with comments flooding in asking for details. By the following morning, local news vans had appeared outside Frank's home, where the renovation work was visibly underway. Reporters began piecing together the story, how America's most beloved actress had returned to her hometown and discovered her former high school janitor, still working at age 80, then decided to change his life completely. Julia's phone buzzed, incessantly with calls from her publicist. It's everywhere, Julia, Rebecca said when she finally answered. Good Morning America wants an exclusive. People magazine is offering a cover story. Ellen's producer has called 3 times. Julia sighed, gazing out the hotel window where she could see a news helicopter hovering in the distance. I never wanted this to become a media circus. Well, it has, Rebecca replied pragmatically. The question is, how do we handle it? That question became more urgent when Julia and Frank tried to visit the Blue Ridge Mountain property later that day. They'd barely made it halfway there when Julia noticed they were being followed by 2 SUVs with camera equipment. I'm so sorry about this, she told Frank as she turned the car around. This wasn't part of the plan. Frank seemed more amused than bothered. Never thought I'd be running from paparazzi at my age, he chuckled. Eleanor would have gotten such a kick out of this. Back at the hotel, Julia found a stack of messages waiting. Interview requests, film offers, even pitches for a movie based on Frank's story. The hotel staff, while professional, couldn't hide their excitement at having a major celebrity in residence, and other guests kept finding excuses to linger in the lobby, hoping for a glimpse of her. This isn't sustainable, Julia realized. She called Rebecca back. We need to get ahead of this. Together they crafted a strategy. Julia would give a single exclusive interview to a respected journalist, with Frank present only if he felt comfortable. She would use the platform not to highlight her own generosity, but to focus attention on the broader issues at stake. The challenges facing elderly Americans, the inadequacy of many pension systems, and the often overlooked contributions of school support staff. And I want to announce something else, Julia added. A foundation for people like Frank. A foundation? Rebecca sounded surprised. That's a major commitment, Julia. I know. I've been thinking about it since I first saw Frank still working at his age. He's not alone in this situation. There are thousands of school janitors, cafeteria workers, bus drivers, people who shape children's lives but struggle to retire with dignity. When Julia presented the idea to Frank over dinner that evening, his reaction surprised her. I think that's just wonderful, he said, his eyes brightening. To think that what's happening to me could help others in the same boat. He hesitated, then added, and if telling our story would help with that, well, I suppose I could manage one interview. Julia reached across the table to squeeze his hand. Are you sure? It would mean exposing your personal circumstances to the world. Frank nodded slowly. Eleanor always said that difficulties have purpose if they can help others. Maybe this is the purpose of all our struggles. 2 days later, they sat together in a carefully arranged setting at the hotel. Not too formal, not too staged. Across from them was Catherine Morley, a respected journalist known for her thoughtful human interest stories. Thank you both for agreeing to this conversation, Catherine began once the cameras were rolling. Frank, let's start with you. How does it feel to have your life completely transformed in just a matter of days? Frank smoothed his freshly pressed shirt, one of several new items Julia had helped him purchase. Overwhelming, he admitted with his characteristic honesty. I've spent most of my life in the background just doing my job, never expected to be sitting in front of cameras talking about myself. As the interview progressed, Frank shared his story with quiet dignity, his decades of service at Campbell High, his devotion to Eleanor during her illness, the financial hardships that had forced him to continue working long past retirement age. I wasn't looking for help, he emphasized, never wanted to be a burden to anyone, but sometimes I guess angels find you anyway. He smiled at Julia. When it was Julia's turn to speak, she redirected the focus from her individual act of kindness to the systemic issues it highlighted. What happened with Frank isn't just a heartwarming story, she said firmly. It's a wake-up call. Our society often fails the very people who hold it together, the ones who clean our schools, serve our children lunch, drive them safely to and from classes every day. She went on to announce the establishment of the Eleanor Davis Foundation, named in honor of Frank's late wife. This foundation will provide supplementary retirement support for school support staff who have fallen through the cracks of our system. People who've given decades of service but still can't afford to retire. Catherine leaned forward. That's a significant commitment. What inspired you to take this beyond helping just one person? Julia glanced at Frank before answering. Years ago, Frank told me that the true measure of success isn't fame or fortune. It's what you do for others when you have the chance. I've carried those words with me throughout my career. This foundation is those words in action. The interview aired the following evening and immediately went viral. Clips spread across social media platforms, accompanied by hashtags like Thank Your Janitor and Remember the Invisible. Former students from schools across the country began sharing stories about the impact support staff had made on their lives. The bus driver who made sure they never missed school during hard times, the cafeteria worker who slipped extra food, to hungry children, the janitor who attended every football game to cheer on the team. Corporate sponsors began reaching out, offering to support the Eleanor Davis Foundation. Other celebrities pledged donations. School districts nationwide started reviewing their retirement policies for support staff. What had begun as one woman's gesture to help one man had sparked a national conversation about gratitude, recognition, and responsibility. Through it all, Frank Davis remained remarkably grounded. When a neighbor brought over a newspaper with his story on the front page, he simply said, "Seems like an awful lot of fuss over an old janitor doing what anyone would do." But privately, sitting with Julia on the hotel balcony after a long day of foundation planning, he confessed, "You know what means the most to me in all this? It's not the money or the house or even that beautiful mountain property." "What is it?" Julia asked. Frank's eyes glistened in the fading light. It's that Eleanor's name will live on through this foundation, that her kindness, her spirit will continue to touch lives even though she's gone. His voice wavered slightly. She always was the best part of me. Julia reached over to take his hand. No cameras present to capture the moment, no audience to perform for. Just two people connected by an unexpected twist of fate that had changed not only their lives but potentially the lives of countless others. The foundation is just the beginning, Julia promised. Eleanor's legacy is in good hands. 3 weeks after Julia Roberts walked back into Frank Davis's life, the renovations on his home were complete. The transformation was nothing short of remarkable. The sagging roof replaced, the outdated systems modernized, the interior refreshed while carefully preserving the character and memories that made it a home. The morning of the unveiling dawned clear and bright, a perfect Georgia. Spring day. Julia had arranged for Frank's children to fly in for the occasion, Sarah from Oregon and Michael from Germany, along with their spouses and children. It would be the first full family reunion the Davises had managed in nearly a decade. "They're here," Julia announced, glancing out the hotel window as a van pulled up. "Ready to meet your family?" Frank nodded, straightening his new shirt nervously. At Julia's insistence, he'd visited a proper tailor for the first time in his life, and the well-fitted clothes gave him a dignified appearance that matched his natural grace. The reunion in the hotel lobby brought tears to even the hotel staff, watching discreetly from a distance. Frank's face lit up as his son Michael, tall and straight-backed in his military bearing, embraced him fiercely. Sarah, who had inherited Eleanor's gentle eyes, couldn't stop crying as she held her father. "You look good, Dad," she kept saying, "really good." The grandchildren, 2 teenagers and a college student, seemed slightly awed by their grandfather's connection to Julia Roberts, but soon relaxed as Frank began telling them stories about their grandmother Eleanor. "She would have loved seeing all of you together like this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. While the family caught up, Julia stepped back, giving them space. This was Frank's moment, not hers. She had deliberately kept the media away from today's events, turning down requests for coverage. The foundation had generated enough publicity. This homecoming would remain private and personal. At noon, they formed a small caravan of vehicles and drove to Frank's house. As they turned onto his street, Frank gasped audibly. The transformation was immediately apparent even from a distance. Gone was the peeling paint and sagging porch. In its place stood a beautifully restored home with a new roof, fresh sage-green paint with white trim, and a completely rebuilt front porch with an accessible ramp discreetly integrated into the design. Eleanor's garden had been expanded and restored to its former glory, with spring flowers in full bloom, creating a riot of color. "Is that really my house?" Frank whispered, as Julia parked in the freshly paved driveway. "It is," she confirmed, watching his reaction carefully. "Everything you've worked for all these years just made a little better." As Frank slowly made his way up the walkway, supported by his son on one side and his daughter on the other, the front door opened to reveal a surprise. Principal Jenkins, Mike the maintenance supervisor, and a dozen other colleagues and friends waited inside. "Welcome home, Frank," they called in unison. Frank paused on the threshold, overwhelmed. Julia had worked with the designers to ensure the home felt familiar despite its upgrades. Eleanor's favorite armchair still occupied its place by the window, though reupholstered in a similar fabric. Family photographs, professionally restored and reframed, lined the walls. The layout remained largely the same, though doorways had been widened and steps eliminated to accommodate Frank's mobility needs as he aged. "It still feels like our home," Frank said softly, running his hand along the refinished mantelpiece where he and Eleanor had hung their Christmas stockings for over 5 decades. The kitchen had received a major upgrade with new appliances and accessible features, but Eleanor's collection of hand-painted plates still decorated one wall. The bathroom had been completely remodeled with safety features, but her favorite seashell soap dish remained by the sink. "You kept all the important things," Frank marveled to Julia. "That was the goal," she replied. "Modern comforts without losing the soul of your home." As Frank moved slowly through the rooms, greeting guests and accepting congratulations, Julia slipped away to prepare the final surprise. She had reserved it for when Frank had absorbed the main renovations. 30 minutes later, she found him, sitting in Eleanor's restored chair, surrounded by his grandchildren. "There's one more thing I'd like to show you," she said. "Something special." She led Frank to what had previously been a rarely used spare bedroom at the back of the house. The door was closed with a simple blue ribbon across it. "This is yours to open," Julia said, handing him a small pair of scissors. Frank cut the ribbon with trembling hands and pushed open the door. The room beyond had been completely transformed into a warm, wood-paneled study. Bookshelves lined one wall filled with volumes on history and gardening, Frank's favorite subjects. Her comfortable desk faced a large window overlooking the backyard garden, but what drew Frank's immediate attention was the wall opposite the window. It held a stunning display, hundreds of handwritten notes, cards, and letters in matching frames, covering the entire surface. "What is all this?" Frank asked, moving closer to examine them. "Letters from former students," Julia explained. "We put out a call through the school network, asking for memories of Mr. Davis from Campbell High. These started arriving almost immediately." Frank adjusted his glasses, reading the nearest note. "Mr. Davis found me hiding in the bathroom after I failed my sets. He told me one test doesn't define my future. I'm now a pediatrician. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. Jennifer Wilkes, class of 1992. Another read, "You caught me vandalizing a locker in 1985. Instead of reporting me, you made me help you clean the whole hallway. That lesson in responsibility changed my path. I became a police officer. Mark Stevens." Tears streamed down Frank's face as he moved from one letter to another. So many names he recognized, so many he'd forgotten but who hadn't forgotten him. "There are more," Julia said softly. "We received over 1,000. The rest are in these albums." She gestured to a shelf of leather-bound books. Frank sank into the desk chair, overwhelmed. "I never knew," he whispered. "All those years, all those kids, I never knew I made any difference." Sarah put her arm around her father's shoulders. "That's because you never did it to be recognized, Dad. You just did it because that's who you are." Michael, standing at attention even in this emotional moment, added, "Mom always knew. She used to tell us stories about students who'd come back, years later, just to see you." As Frank's family and friends gathered in the study, exclaiming over the letters and sharing their own memories, Julia quietly stepped outside onto the back porch. The spring air was soft with the scent of blooming azaleas, and birds called from the trees that bordered the property. In her decades in Hollywood, Julia had experienced nearly every emotion that could be scripted or directed. She had made audiences laugh and cry, had portrayed love and loss with convincing authenticity. But nothing in her career had prepared her for the pure, unscripted joy of this moment, of seeing a life of quiet service finally acknowledged and honored. Her phone buzzed with messages from her agent about upcoming projects, from the foundation team about next steps, from the documentary director about final edits. All of it could wait. For now, she simply wanted to savor this moment, the culmination of a chance encounter that had evolved into something far more meaningful than she could have imagined. Inside, she could hear Frank's laughter mingling with the voices of his family. The sound carried through the open window, drifting up toward the cloudless sky. Perhaps Julia liked to think all the way to wherever Eleanor might be watching. "We did it," Julia whispered, as if Eleanor could hear her. "He's going to be okay." Now, a gentle breeze rustled the azaleas, sending a shower of pink petals across the newly laid patio. Julia smiled, taking it as a sign of approval from a woman she had never met, but whose presence she had felt throughout this journey. It was time to rejoin the celebration, not as Julia Roberts the celebrity, but simply as Julia, the girl from Smyrna who had found her way back home just in time to make a difference. 6 months later, Julia Roberts stood on the wide porch of a rustic cabin nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The autumn air was crisp, painting the surrounding forest in brilliant shades of orange, red, and gold. Below, the valley stretched out in a breathtaking panorama, misty blue mountains layered to the horizon, exactly as Eleanor Davis had always dreamed. "Coffee's ready," called Frank from inside, "with a splash of that fancy vanilla creamer you brought." Julia smiled, taking one last look at the view before stepping into the warm cabin. In the months since his retirement, Frank had flourished. The perpetual exhaustion that had lined his face had faded, replaced by a healthy glow. He moved more easily now, his joint pain managed by proper medical care and the absence of punishing physical labor. "This view never gets old," Julia said, accepting the steaming mug. "Eleanor chose perfectly." Frank nodded, settling into his favorite chair by the stone fireplace. "She always said there was something healing about these mountains." He gestured around the cozy living room with its hand-hewn beams and comfortable furniture. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is mine." "Believe it," Julia said firmly. "No one deserves it more." They had established a routine during these monthly visits. Julia would drive up from Atlanta, where she was filming her newest project, and they would spend the weekend catching up. Frank would share stories about his grandchildren's visits, his volunteer work at the local library, or his newfound hobby of woodworking. Julia would bring news of the Eleanor Davis Foundation's progress and developments in the documentary that had now expanded to include other school support staff across the country. "Have you seen the latest numbers?" Julia asked, pulling out her tablet. "The foundation has helped 37 school employees retire with dignity in just 6 months. Frank leaned forward to examine the screen, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "Look at that. Janitors, cafeteria workers, crossing guards. Eleanor would be so proud." The foundation had grown beyond anything they had initially imagined. What began as Julia's personal project had attracted corporate sponsors, educational advocates, and policymakers interested in addressing the systemic issues facing school support staff. Several states had already begun reviewing their retirement policies for non-teaching personnel, citing the Davis Standard as their benchmark. "And the scholarship program launches next semester," Julia added. 10 full rides for students pursuing careers in education, with priority given to those interested in school administration or policy. People who might someday change the system from within. Frank's eyes crinkled with his smile. From one old janitor to nationwide impact. Who would have thought? "I would," Julia said simply, because it was never just about one janitor. It was about recognizing the invisible people who shape our lives, the ones we look past every day but who make everything else possible. There. Conversation was interrupted by Frank's phone ringing, a video call from his daughter Sarah. Julia watched as Frank's face lit up at the sight of his family on the screen, his fluency with the technology a testament to how much he had embraced this new chapter of his life. "Dad, we've booked the flights for Thanksgiving," Sarah announced. "All of us together at the cabin, just like we planned." "Wonderful," Frank exclaimed. "There's plenty of room for everyone here." After the call ended, Frank sat quietly for a moment, emotion evident in his expression. 6 months ago, I couldn't afford a plane ticket to see my own grandchildren. Now my whole family is coming here for Thanksgiving." He looked at Julia with eyes bright with unshed tears. "How do you thank someone for giving you your life back?" "You're already doing it," Julia replied softly. "Every time you enjoy this cabin, every time you spend time with your family, every time you volunteer at the library instead of mopping floors, that's my thank you." Later that afternoon, they drove into the small mountain town nearby for supplies. Julia noticed how Frank greeted several locals by name: the baker who saved his favorite sourdough bread, the librarian who recommended history books, the barber who gave him the best haircut in 3 counties. In just 6 months, he had built a new community here, one where he was known not as the elderly janitor, but as Frank Davis, the friendly retiree with fascinating stories and a generous spirit. At the general store, the cashier smiled in recognition. "Mr. Davis, those children's books you read at Story Hour last week were a hit. My son hasn't stopped talking about it. I'll be there next Tuesday with some new ones," Frank promised. As they loaded groceries into Julia's car, a young woman approached, hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Julia Roberts, and is this—" She glanced at Frank. "Mr. Davis? From the documentary?" Julia nodded, instinctively moving closer to Frank in case he needed to be shielded from unwanted attention. But the young woman wasn't seeking an autograph. Instead, she turned to Frank. "My grandmother was a school secretary for 40 years. After seeing your story, my family helped her apply to the Eleanor Davis Foundation. She received support last month." Her voice caught. She cried when she got the news, said it was the first time in her life she felt like her work mattered to anyone outside those school walls. Frank reached out to squeeze the woman's hand. Please tell your grandmother that her work always mattered. Some things just take too long to be recognized. On the drive back to the cabin, they traveled in comfortable silence, both reflecting on the encounter. The documentary, now streaming on a major platform, had indeed sparked a movement. Thank Your Janitor had evolved into See the Invisible, a broader campaign encouraging people to acknowledge and support those working behind the scenes in all sectors. As the sun began to set, bathing the mountains in golden light, Julia helped Frank prepare a simple dinner in the cabin's kitchen. Through the window, they could see the first stars appearing in the deepening blue sky. Sometimes I wonder, Frank said, pausing in his task of chopping vegetables, what Eleanor would think of all this. I think she knows, Julia replied. I think she's been part of this from the beginning. Frank nodded, a peaceful smile crossing his face. That day you walked back into Campbell High. Of all the days, of all the times you could have returned, you came exactly when I needed you most. Eleanor always did have perfect timing. Later, as they sat on the porch watching the moon rise over the mountains, Julia reflected on the strange, beautiful journey that had brought them here. From a chance reunion in a high school hallway to a national movement for recognition and change, all because she had paused long enough to really see someone who had once seen her. You know, Frank said, breaking the comfortable silence, I used to worry about what my legacy would be, whether any of my years of work would matter once I was gone. He gestured toward the valley below, toward the world that had been transformed by their shared story. I don't worry about that anymore. Julia reached over to squeeze his hand. This man who had once been just the janitor, but who now represented something so much larger, a symbol of all those whose quiet service forms the foundation upon which communities are built. Some legacies aren't carved in stone or written in history books, she said. Some live on in the lives they touch, in the changes they inspire, in the kindness they spark. Like ripples in a pond, Frank nodded. Exactly like that, Julia agreed. Gazing out at the misty mountains that Eleanor had dreamed of, mountains that now stood as a testament to the power of being truly seen even after a lifetime in the shadows. When Julia Roberts agreed to return to Campbell High School in Smyrna, Georgia, for a documentary about her journey to stardom, she expected to find memories of her teenage years buried in the hallways and classrooms where she once dreamed of becoming an actress. What she didn't expect was to find Mr. Frank Davis, the same janitor who had shown her kindness during her most vulnerable moments as a teenager, still pushing a mop through those same hallways at 80 years old. The discovery would shake the Academy Award-winning actress to her core and set in motion a chain of events that would change not just Mr. Davis's life, but spark a movement that would reach far beyond the walls of their shared past. The Georgia summer heat pressed against the windows of Campbell High as Julia's black SUV pulled into the nearly empty parking lot. School had been out for 2 weeks, perfect timing for filming without disrupting classes. Julia sat in the back seat, taking a moment to collect herself. It had been 35 years since she'd walked these grounds. You okay back there? Her driver asked, catching her eye in the rearview mirror. Julia nodded, smoothing her simple white blouse. Just time-traveling a bit. She stepped out of the car, her sandals touching the asphalt that had once burned the bare feet of a teenage girl who would run across it to make it to drama club on time. The building looked smaller somehow, painted in different colors, but the essence remained the same. The documentary crew was already setting up equipment in the main entrance. Lights, cameras, sound equipment, all the trappings of Hollywood invading this small-town high school. The principal, a woman younger than Julia herself, greeted her with barely contained excitement. Ms. Roberts, what an honor. I grew up watching your films. To think you once walked these same halls. Julia smiled warmly. Please call me Julia. And yes, it feels like another lifetime. The tour began as expected, the classroom where she'd studied literature, the small auditorium where she'd performed in her first play, the cafeteria where she'd often sat alone, dreaming of California. The camera crew followed, capturing her reactions, her memories, her reflections on how this ordinary school had shaped an extraordinary life. "And this," the principal said, opening a door to a long corridor lined with lockers, "is where your old locker was." Julia paused, a flood of memories washing over her. She could almost see her younger self, awkward and uncertain, arranging her books, practicing her smile in the small magnetic mirror she'd hung inside. "Number 237, Julia said softly. "I remember." As they moved through the hallway, Julia noticed something at the far end, a figure slowly working a mop across the floor in methodical, practiced movements. Something about the scene captured her attention. A single person working in the empty school during summer break, the gentle rhythm of the mop against the gleaming floor. "Is that—" she began, taking a few steps forward. The janitor looked up at the sound of her voice, his weathered face framed by wispy white hair. His uniform hung a bit loose on his thin frame, but there was a quiet dignity in his posture, in the careful way he wrung out his mop. Julia froze mid-step, her heart suddenly racing. Despite the decades that had passed, despite the wrinkles that now lined his face, she recognized him instantly. "Mr. Davis?" she called, her voice echoing down the hallway. The old man squinted, tilting his head slightly. Even from a distance, Julia could see the confusion in his eyes, the effort to place her face. "It's Julia," she said, walking toward him now, the documentary crew momentarily forgotten. "Julia Roberts." Recognition dawned slowly across his features, followed by disbelief, and then a smile that transformed his entire face. "Little Julie Roberts," he said, his voice rougher than she remembered, but with the same warm southern cadence. "Well, I'll be." Julia closed the distance between them, ignoring the camera crew scrambling to follow. Without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around the surprised janitor, embracing him as the scent of floor polish and lemon cleaner brought back a rush of high school memories. "Mr. Davis," she said, stepping back to look at him properly. "You're still here." He chuckled, leaning slightly on his mop. "Where else would I be? These floors don't clean themselves." Julia studied him, taking in the details, how his once strong hands now showed blue veins beneath paper-thin skin, how his shoulders stooped slightly under the weight of years, how despite it all his eyes still held the same kindness she remembered. "How old are you now, Mr. Davis, if you don't mind me asking?" "Turned 80 last month," he said with a hint of pride. "Been working in this school for nearly 50 years now." 50 years. Julia couldn't hide her shock. "But that means you were already working here when I was a student." Mr. Davis nodded. "Started in 74, seen a lot of students come and go, but not many who made it as big as you did." He smiled again, revealing slightly crooked teeth. "Always knew you would, though." Something in his words, in the sincerity behind them, touched Julia deeply. As the principal explained to the confused documentary crew who this elderly janitor was, Julia's mind was racing with questions. Why was Mr. Davis still working at his age? Shouldn't he be enjoying retirement? Did he need the money? Was he alone? In the world? The documentary director approached, sensing a potential narrative goldmine. "Ms. Roberts, would you like us to include this reunion in the film? It seems like a meaningful connection." Julia nodded absently, still processing the situation. "Yes, of course." Then, turning back to Mr. Davis, she asked, "When do you finish?" "Work today?" The question seemed to surprise him. "About 4 o'clock, same as always." "Would you join me for dinner? To catch up?" The words came naturally, without calculation or hesitation. Mr. Davis looked down at his worn uniform, then back, at the famous actress standing before him. "I'm not exactly dressed for dinner with a movie star." Julia laughed, the warm, genuine laugh that had charmed audiences worldwide. "Neither am I, just two old friends catching up." As Mr. Davis considered her invitation, Julia knew that this unexpected reunion was about to change everything. Something wasn't right about an 80-year-old man still mopping floors for a living, and Julia Roberts, the girl from Smyrna who had never forgotten where she came from, wasn't going to walk away without making it right. What began as a simple visit to her old school for a documentary was about to become something much more significant. Sometimes life brings people back together for a reason, and Julia was certain that finding Mr. Davis again after all these years was no coincidence. It was the beginning of a story neither of them could have anticipated, but one that would soon capture the hearts of millions. Julia sat across from Mr. Davis in a quiet corner booth at Nell's Diner, a local establishment that had somehow survived the decades while everything around it changed. The red vinyl seats were worn but clean, the jukebox in the corner playing soft classics from the 80s, songs that had been new when Julia walked these streets as a teenager. "Still make the best cherry pie in Georgia," Mr. Davis said, cutting into the dessert they'd ordered after their simple meal of burgers and fries. His hands trembled slightly, the veins prominent against paper-thin skin. Julia watched him, the whirlwind of the day's filming fading as memories flooded back, memories of a different Julia Roberts, a girl with wild auburn hair and uncertain eyes navigating the treacherous waters of high school, while harboring dreams too big for Smyrna, Georgia. "Do you remember the first time we really talked, Mr. Davis?" she asked, stirring her coffee. The elderly janitor's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "Sure do. Found you crying in the auditorium after school. Must have been your sophomore year." Julia nodded, transported back to that pivotal afternoon. It had been the day of callbacks for the spring production of Our Town. 16-year-old Julia had prepared for weeks, pouring her heart into the audition. She'd been so certain she'd get the lead role of Emily Webb, so certain this would be her moment to shine. But Ms. Winters, the drama teacher, had other ideas. "Julia, you have potential, but you're just not ready for a lead role. Maybe next." "Yeah." Those words had cut deeper than any teenage insult. After everyone left, Julia had hidden in the darkened auditorium, silent tears streaming down her face. She'd been so engrossed in her misery that she hadn't noticed the janitor entering, with his cleaning cart until he spoke. "Reckon them stage lights need some time to cool down before I shut everything off." Julia had hastily wiped her tears. "I'm sorry, I'll go." "No rush," Mr. Davis had said, slowly sweeping the floor nearby. "Sometimes an empty stage is the best place to think." Something about his gentle presence had opened the floodgates. "I didn't get the part," she'd blurted out. "I thought I was good enough, but I wasn't." Mr. Davis had leaned on his broom, studying her with kind eyes. "You know, I've watched a lot of school plays over the years. Been cleaning this auditorium since before you were born." "So?" "So I've seen students come and go. The ones who make... That aren't always the ones who get the first big part. They're the ones who keep showing up even when things don't go their way." He'd resumed his sweeping, adding quietly, "Rejection isn't a stop sign, Miss Julia. It's just a detour." Back in the present, Julia smiled at the memory. "You told me rejection was just a detour." Mr. Davis chuckled. "Did I now? Sounds wiser than I had a right to be." It stuck with me, through a lot of early rejections in Hollywood.